Hi, it's Justice Paul Thissen, and I want to thank the students at Morris Area High School for sharing some questions with me about my work at the Minnesota Supreme Court. Really good questions I got, so thank you for doing that. And so I'm just going to run through some of them here, and you can always feel free to email me if you have any follow-up questions at paul.thissen, Thissen, at courts.state.mn.us. So the first question, a good one from Aiden and from Ava, which is, do you enjoy your job? And I really do. It's the best job that I think I've ever had. And the thing I most like about it is that I get the chance to actually think about things. In the jobs that I had before, where I worked as a lawyer, as a litigator, and when I worked as a legislator and a politician, so much of my life and my professional life was reacting to things. I was responding to other people's questions and ideas and that kind of thing. In this job, I actually get and have to respond right away, typically, or very quickly. This time, in this job, I get to sit back and really think through things, so I feel much more comfortable about the job, and it's actually much more interesting. It kind of taps into my curiosity about things. Um, the other thing that I love about the job is I feel like in this job I get the chance to help Minnesotans in a very important way. You know, one of the things I talked about in the earlier video was how the cases that come before the court are kind of about the most fundamental things that impact Minnesotans' lives, and having a chance to kind of think through those issues and come up with fair solutions, I think is meaningful to me and hopefully meaningful to Minnesota. Um, Justin asked, what are some of the responsibilities of the job? Another really good question. So we really have two things as a justice. One, of course, is to write the opinions, to make the decisions. So we hear the cases, we figure out what the answer, as far as we are concerned, is the right answer, and then issue those opinions to set the law for Minnesota, to kind of set some parameters for how people are supposed to behave and how government is supposed to behave. The other big part of the job that was a big surprise to me was we have the administrative responsibility for the whole court system in Minnesota. So all of the district courts, the Court of Appeals, and the Minnesota Supreme Court. At the end of the day, because of separation of powers, we're the ones that make the decisions about a lot of the operational things, how they operate, what the rules are for when people come into court, who can be a lawyer and who can't be a lawyer, and who can appear in court on behalf of their clients. And important to me, as I said in that earlier video, we also have the chance to work very hard on access to justice issues, making sure that people do have their voice heard and that they're represented. And so it's kind of both of those responsibilities are an important part of the work we do. And then the last thing, and I think is important, is stuff like this, is getting out and talking to Minnesotans about what our courts do and about why they're important, and responding to Minnesotans' concerns about how the courts treated them or operate in general. We want to make sure that our courts are fair and that people feel like their voices are being heard. And so doing this and educating people and listening to people about their experiences with the court is another important part of our responsibility. Haley, I think it's Haley, my writing is not too great, said, how do you think about the time you spend on the job versus the time you spend with your family? And that's a really good question, I think, for a lot of people in their jobs, and trying to figure out how do you strike that right balance. This is it's a busy job, and we work very hard in the court, but I have to say it's probably also the most balanced job that I've ever had. A lot of the work that I can do is reading and writing, that I have to do is reading and writing, and sometimes I can just do that from my home and be able to be around with my family more, which is really important to me. I have 3 kids. I have a daughter who's in college, a junior in college, who is back now because of the virus, and then 2 boys, one a senior and one a junior in high school. And so we do spend a lot of time on going to kids' sports a lot, and with homework and all that other kind of family stuff. But the best part of this job, as it relates to my family, is it's the one that my kids can actually most relate to, because really what this job is about is stories. Stories of Minnesotans, getting in a dispute oftentimes, but they're a story, and then you can kind of tell the story and say, how do you think this story should end up? What's the fair result? And they can really understand that and actually have really good insights into kind of how to think about the case. So it's been a good job from that perspective. Faith and Rachel both asked, what's the hardest and easiest part of the job, or asked questions similar to that. The hardest part of the job, I think, for me, the two things is first, there's a lot of areas of law that we have to deal with that I never had an experience with before getting on the court. And so I really have to learn the law from the ground up in those cases, which is both interesting and kind of, again, taps into my curiosity. But you also worry that when you're learning law from the get-go, you're going to miss something that's really important. And that's why the lawyers are so important, because they are experts in the law in that area and in their case, and can give a lot of guidance and help kind of in pointing the direction for how we ought to start looking at the cases. And it's also a reason we're very lucky to have 7 justices, because usually at least 1 or 2 of the justices has had some experience in whatever particular area of law that we're dealing with. The other hard part is there are cases, many cases actually, when the answer is not 100% clear. And you have to kind of, at the end of the day, make a judgment. That's what judging is all about what the right answer is. For instance, on a constitutional case like the First Amendment, there's values that are competing there. There's a value of the right to free speech and the free exchange of ideas, which we think is really important in our democracy and getting to the right decision. If everybody can kind of have input, we believe in America, as is captured in the First Amendment, that you're going to get to a better answer. On the other hand, sometimes speech can be very hurtful. And we also have an obligation as a government and as a society to protect each other. So we had a case, for instance, a year ago called AJB. It was a student in Shakopee High School who sent a series of tweets that was bullying, basically, kind of awful stuff, and directed, or he tagged another student in the school who was a little bit more vulnerable. And that the person that sent the tweets was actually criminally charged, with what we call harassment. And we had a question under the First Amendment, under the harassment statute, which says you can't communicate in any way in a way that's going to make someone afraid or what have you. Is that protected by the First Amendment? And there you're weighing the ability to speak out and to share your ideas on things against protecting people who are vulnerable. And so those kind of cases are really the hardest kind of cases that we have to deal with. The favorite part of my job, again, is doing stuff like this. It's going around and talking to Minnesotans about what our courts do, the good stuff they do, the challenges that we're facing, and listening to them about what their experiences are, because it helps me do my job that much better. Madison and Joseph asked, what's the hardest decision you've had to make as a judge? And I guess the thing that I would say about that, again, there's hard cases, but the hardest ones for me are when you are having to affirm, because the legislature and the law says so and the jury made the decision, a life sentence for people who were involved in a crime that resulted in a murder, but they weren't actually the ones that pulled the trigger, if you will. We have something called felony murder in Minnesota and across the country, which is if you are part of a crime that's a felony, like if you're going to rob a store and then one of the people you're doing that with pulls the trigger and kills the clerk, an awful thing, obviously, but you're just as responsible. You're just as guilty if you didn't pull the trigger, if you were just there as part of the robbery, as the person who actually made the decision and pulled the trigger that killed him. And in those cases, for me, those are really hard cases. It is what the law is, but we just watched a movie last night with my kids called Waves. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's one of the parts of the movie. Well, really, what the movie is about is a kid who gets into trouble, and I don't want to give too much away if you haven't seen it. But the thing that's so striking to me about that I see in this job all the time is you see these cases where they're just moments that happen in people's lives that if just a different decision had been made in that split second, so many people's lives would be so different. The victim's life would be different. Obviously, they wouldn't be injured. The person that committed the crime's life would be different because they wouldn't be going to jail and they wouldn't have done this awful thing that they have to carry with them for the rest of their life. So many times in the work that I've done, both in my legal career and as a judge, you just see these moments and you say, God, I wish I could just turn back time and let them make a different decision because we'd be so much better off and people's lives would be so much better off. I think that's kind of those are the hardest kinds of decisions that we have to make. Hannah Mae asks, How do you keep your personal opinions from affecting your decisions? Which is a really, really good question. Thank you for asking that. And it's something that as judges we think about a lot. It's something kind of always on the top of our mind. We pay a lot of attention to it. And I guess that's the first answer to your question, is that we pay attention to it. We always think, okay, let's make sure that this decision is being driven by the law and by what the elected representatives in our legislature and the governor have said is the law for the most part, and stick to that instead of what I would personally do. Because when you have the rule of law, what that's about is you're going to follow and apply the law equally to everybody. And if you bring in kind of personal decisions, the biggest danger is that you're going to apply the law differently to different people because of things that don't or shouldn't matter. And that's what I most try to think about. A couple other things that are very helpful in this regard. There are 7 of us. Again, we make all of our decisions, all 7 of us, and having the other 6 people there is a good check to make sure that the decision I'm thinking about in a particular case isn't getting too far off the rails. Now, there are times when I'm the only one that dissents when I write a separate opinion because I really feel strongly, but having those other judges there with me helping to make the decision helps a lot with keeping the personal opinions, if you will, out of it. We also have precedent, so it's not just the 7 of us, but all of the Supreme Court justices back to the beginning of Minnesota, so 105 of us at this point. We rely on precedent, on cases that came before, and it's very rare that we overturn kind of a principle of law that our court has said in a prior case. And so that also keeps us kind of on track and online. The other thing that I try to do, which is another justice, Justice Chudich, kind of gave me the heads up on, is when you're thinking about a case, try to put another person in the context of whoever the perpetrator, if you will, in a criminal case. So if it's a sexual harassment case, try to flip the genders and see if you would come up with the same decision. Kind of trying to use literary imagination, if you will, trying to imagine different scenarios helps very much to take the personal opinion out of it. Now, the last thing I do want to say about this is I don't think it's the worst thing in the world that judges actually do allow their gut reaction and their life experience to help them make decisions, because decisions aren't always 100% clear-cut. The words on the page aren't always 100% clear, and judging is about judgment. I mean, one of the things judges do is to exercise judgment. And, we could have robots doing this work. In fact, there's a couple courts across the country that are using artificial intelligence to help them make their decisions, district courts primarily, and it's a very interesting experience. But I think you lose something when you lose the human element of what judging is all about. And I think at the end of the day, we want other people, making decisions. That's what juries are about. I mean, it's your peers kind of making a decision about what the right result is, and we want human judges bringing all of themselves to the case to make the most just, and remembering that justice is not just about inflicting punishment, but it's also about mercy and compassion. I think that those things are really, really important as well. Ashlyn and Madison and Aaron all asked questions about the Constitution and how you interpret the Constitution. Again, a really good question. The first place you look, obviously, is the words of the Constitution, constitutional provision you're interpreting or the amendment you're interpreting. So if it's the First Amendment, it's the words that are about the right to free speech. If it's the Fourth Amendment, it's about, is this search unreasonable? So you look at the words, you look at case law. A lot of our constitutional provisions have lots and lots of other cases kind of applying the principles of the constitutional provisions, and others, professors and others who have written about the Constitution. But if you think about some of our constitutional provisions, you'll see that many of them aren't always 100% clear. For instance, the Fourth Amendment says you can't have unreasonable searches and seizures. Well, what is a reasonable search? What is an unreasonable search? The words themselves don't always tell you exactly what that means. The Eighth Amendment is about cruel and unusual, or cruel or unusual, depending on whether it's the federal or the state constitution, cruel or unusual punishment. Well, what is cruel or unusual punishment? How do you figure out what that means? And so those are the kind of, when you get to those circumstances where you're actually, the words aren't going to tell you the whole story. And so the things that I like to go and look at are what the people that wrote the amendment were trying to accomplish. I read a lot of history about the Revolutionary period, when in the constitutional period, when the Constitution was drafted, about the Civil War, when some of our most important constitutional provisions, like the uh, the equality provision, that everybody's equal under the law, and the due process clause applying to the states, what that means, and the New Deal period, when we kind of had another constitutional transformation in the country. And some Minnesota history about the beginning of Minnesota's constitution, when that was framed in 1857 and 1858. What were people thinking about? Just to get a sense of what they were trying to accomplish when they wrote the provisions. And then think about how what they're trying to accomplish plays out in modern life, which is different sometimes. And then at the end of the day, what constitutional stuff, like I said before, is about balancing different values. The value of free speech versus the value of keeping people safe. The value of public safety versus the value of not having unreasonable searches. And trying to balance out, well, which of those values is more important in this particular case? What do we need to protect here? And that weighing out is a lot of what goes into the way that balancing is a lot of how I think about constitutional issues. I have a couple of questions here that kind of go together, I think. Chayla, I hope I said that right, and Chinoa, I hope I said that right, and Max. And Max, if you'd stop leaning back in your chair, that would be really great. Asked about, have you ever had a decision that you disliked or that you would take back, essentially? And as I thought about this, nothing really jumped out at me. You know, there are some decisions that we as a court have made and that I've signed on to, that I may feel less comfortable about the outcome, less sure about the outcome. But we have 7 justices working together. We work really hard. We think really hard. We talk a lot about the tough cases. And our cases actually go through 4 reviews as well. So we vote on them and we talk about them in conference. Then someone writes the opinion and shares it with all the 7 justices, and all the 6 other justices make their comments and weigh in on it. We have what's called a cite check, where we have a law clerk go through and make sure that the law is actually what we're saying it is, and the cases that we're citing to are saying what we say they're saying. And then we have another review by a commissioner. The last review is by who we call the commissioner of our court, who's a lawyer who kind of reads through every case at the end to make sure we're not getting too far out. So there's a lot of checks in kind of reaching the decisions we reach. The toughest cases I've ever had, not as a judge but as a lawyer, I had a death row case in Texas that we were there for 10 years. And ultimately, the guy, we determined he was wrongly sentenced to death, and he is now out and working as a minister down in Texas. But taking 10 years to move the Texas courts, I feel so lucky when I think back on that, how more open and transparent and fair our Minnesota courts are. I mean, for instance, the judge that we took our appeal to, basically from the death sentence, was the prosecutor on the case. So the person that actually was the prosecutor for the state that convicted the guy and sent him to death row then became a judge, and that judge then oversaw a review of the decision on which she was the prosecutor. It just was kind of outrageous to me. But so I feel very lucky that would never happen here in Minnesota. And the second case, I had a first-degree murder case here out of St. Paul in Minnesota when I was a public defender, that I took up on appeal. I didn't do the trial, but took up on appeal all the way to the Supreme Court. And then on post-conviction, so another appeal after he had gone to jail, because we found some new evidence that went again to the Supreme Court. And he's still in jail. And he's the one person that in all my time, I really don't think he committed the crime. And that one I carry with me still to this day. It kind of weighs heavily on me. Angel asks, what are some of the traits that someone should have to qualify as a justice? Another really good question. So I think a couple things. One is a willingness to listen and keep an open mind and an open heart, and to respect the people that are coming before you. I mean, one thing that you have to work hard at, and I'm not always 100% good at, but you have to remember that each case that comes in front of you, I mean, that's really the most important thing to these people in their lives at that moment. And they have legitimate concerns and they want to be heard. And so making sure that you are treating people with respect and you're a person that's going to treat people with respect and to really listen to their case and think about their case is important. Fairness, obviously, is really important. Being willing to do justice and to make hard decisions is a really important trait, but to temper that, with compassion and mercy as well. Curiosity, I think, is maybe the most important one, to really try to understand what's going on in a particular case. And then I think broad experience in the law, the kind of legal work you've done, but also just in life, I think can bring a lot to bear on making a good judge or a good justice. So all of those things, I think, together. Ashlyn asks, can you take back a law you approved? Well, another good question. As a judge, and as judges, we can change our interpretation of the law. But as I said before a little bit, we are bound by what we call precedent. Another way people say it is a Latin words called stare decisis, which means that if we've made a decision in the past as a Supreme Court, then it's very difficult or very rare circumstance that we would actually change our minds later on. We don't think of ourselves as individual judges that make a decision. We think of ourselves as a court. And so our court in 1950 and 1900 is the same court as it is today, and we speak as a court. And so overturning our prior decisions are very difficult. Now, sometimes, clearly the legislature has the power to overturn any decision that we make, unless it's a constitutional decision, unless we say a law violates the First Amendment. They can't just reenact that. But if it's a statutory interpretation or an interpretation of what we call common law, so when people get in a car accident, how do we allocate responsibility between them two to make sure people are compensated? The legislature can weigh in and always change the law on that. That's their prerogative, that's their power. And sometimes we ask them to do it. If there's an unclear law that we find very difficult, we say, if the legislature intended a different outcome on this, they should do that. In fact, the very first case I think that I wrote was a very unclear statute in our criminal laws. And one of the footnotes, we called on the legislature to say, you should fix this. You should, clarify what you mean. And they did the next session. So there is kind of an interaction between the branches in that way. Ashlyn, Faith, and Jack asked, do qualifications for running for office differ by state? And they do. Every state has different rules. In Minnesota, there's very few requirements, actually, to be a judge. The Constitution says that you have to be learned in the law. I don't think that necessarily even requires a law degree, although I think every judge has, since we've had law schools, has passed the bar and been a lawyer. But it just says you have to be learned in the law. And the only other real requirement in Minnesota is that you have to retire at age 70. We have a mandatory retirement age at age 70 for all judges. In the legislature, just for what it's worth, you have to be able to vote in Minnesota. You have to have lived in Minnesota for a year, lived in your district for 6 months, and be 21 years old. And for governor, you have to be 25 years old, and you have to be a citizen. So for the legislature, you just have to be able to vote. Now, today, that means you have to be a citizen. That's not always been the case in Minnesota history. But for a governor, you actually have to be a U.S. citizen, and you have to have resided in Minnesota for a year. So there's very kind of few actual requirements. There's obviously a lot more requirements that we talked about before about what makes a good judge, but those are the legal requirements in Minnesota. Tyler and Ella asked, is it easy or difficult to run for governor, and how do you start? So you probably have talked to your teacher about the fact that I was in the legislature, but I also ran for governor in Minnesota. Not successfully, but that's how it goes sometimes. And it's both easy and difficult. There's a lot of joys to running for governor. The biggest ones for me, and I've kind of maybe a broken record on this, but it was the chance to travel across the state. And when you run for governor in Minnesota, it's a very small group that you get to talk to. You get to talk to people in very small groups. It's a very retail kind of politics, and you really get to learn a lot. I've traveled to cattle and dairy farms, manufacturing plants. I've visited schools. I've been to sewage plants and to state parks, and I've been out with loggers and to lumber mills, and you just get to see so much of the state and to understand so much of the state. I spent a lot of time in Morris. Both I had meetings at the Pizza Ranch and at the University of Minnesota Morris, talking with students, of course. I've door knocked up along Crystal Lake and talked to people there, and as well as door knocking in the middle of Morris itself. The hardest part is the long hours. You're away from your family, and the worst part is frankly having to raise money, because you have to raise so much money to run for office, and be on the phone asking people for money was never my favorite thing. A couple more questions and then we'll be done. This is running kind of long, I'm sorry. Mr. Howden asked, how has running for office changed in the digital age? Well, and it's changed quite a bit. When I came in and ran for my first race in 2002, so 18 years ago, it was mostly door knocking and mail. There was no social media. There was the start of communication for political purposes by email, but most of it was kind of just the traditional stuff of newspaper ads, mail, and going out and door knocking people and calling people on the phone. Today it's much different, and there's some really good things. You can reach a lot more people. You can engage with them in different ways that suits how they want to work and how they want to live. It's a lot cheaper. It really there's this empowerment of people to be able to participate in the process a lot more with social media and in the digital age. I also think, though, there's some downsides. I think the nature of social media and kind of communication these days is much more about attention grabbing. There's less thoughtful discussion, I think, and it tends also to become more divisive. I think that's part of what we've been seeing. At the end of the day, though, I have to say, with all the tools that we have, and we're going to have to use a lot more of them this year than in the past, probably because of everything that's going on, there really is nothing like sitting down face to face and having conversation with someone to really move hearts and minds and to get to the right answer. And so I still am a big believer in those person-to-person meetings in small groups and one-on-one and at the doors. I think that makes a big difference. The last question I have is from Elliot, and it's, what do you consider the greatest or most helpful achievement in state government? And a couple of things came to mind. One was I worked very hard on legislation for covering kids with health care, and we got about 100,000 more kids in Minnesota with access to see a nurse or a doctor when they needed to, which I think can make and does make a big difference in people's lives. But I'm going to give a much more boring answer in a sense, and that is we brought, in the time that I was in leadership in the legislature, we brought fiscal order back to Minnesota. We actually, the first 10 years I served in the legislature, from 2003 to 2013, we had a deficit all but 1 year, where we were having to cut programs, having to cut schools, having to cut colleges, having to not invest in roads and infrastructure, not invest in local communities and small towns that needed help. We weren't able to do any of that stuff because of the constraints. And in 2013, when I was speaker, we had a $6 billion budget deficit, another deficit. But we were able to balance that deficit and also make some investments in things like all-day kindergarten for the first time in Minnesota, real first investment in early childhood education in Minnesota. We froze college tuitions. We did a whole variety of things. But we also balanced our budget and did it in a way that was fiscally responsible. And we've never had a budget deficit in Minnesota since then. We may now be facing one because of this, the impact of the virus on our economy. But getting that stability in place and the ability to make long-range planning and to make investments in the people of Minnesota instead of always having to cut programs or to do things halfway, I think that was the most important thing. If I think back on my time in the legislature, that I and the people that I was working with, obviously it's a joint effort, were able to accomplish. And we put in place a rainy day fund. So we have $2 billion in Minnesota. A little more than that in reserve. And when we're facing this crisis with the coronavirus and all of that, having that cushion, able to draw on those resources to pay for doctors and more healthcare costs that are going to come with this, to make sure that we can continue to invest in our schools, that we can continue to make sure that people have access to good healthcare, that we can continue to make sure we're making investments in our housing and in our roads and in our other infrastructure. Making sure that our police are still well-funded. All of those things is an important legacy and something I probably think is the thing I'm most proud of, I guess. Well, thank you for your time, and I hope that you have a really great rest of your year. And again, if you want to email me with any further follow-up questions, please do. Thanks.